Okay, let's unpack this. We are about to dive into a period of Earth history so extreme, so radically different from our modern world. It almost defies imagination.
It really
I
does.
mean, imagine stepping out, not into a different country, but into a different planet altogether.
Hmm.
A place where the sheer concentration of oxygen in the air makes the world flammable.
Right, where the air itself might be a danger.
Exactly. You look up, and dragonflies have wingspans the size of seagulls. You look down, and scorpions are the length of, what, human arms?
At least, and the forests?
The forests, an endless canopy made of trees that look less like oak or maple and more like these gigantic scale-covered pillars reaching, I don't know, 160 feet into the sky.
And what's so fascinating here is that this immense scope of geological and biological change, this period we call the Carboniferous, starting about 358 million years ago, it's not just some, dramatic chapter in deep time.
No, it's foundational.
It's the period that literally created the foundations of our modern industrialized world. It was all defined by a runaway ecological process.
A green explosion.
A green explosion that triggered global cooling and, in the process, stored up all the coal that would power human civilization millions of years later.
That is the ultimate aha moment we are hunting for today. I mean, the irony is just staggering. We have a stack of incredible sources detailing the forces at play here. This massive global chill, the late Paleozoic Ice Age.
The explosive rise of life under these hyperoxic conditions.
And then the great collapse of the mighty swamp forests and this deep geological legacy left behind.
Our mission is to take these sources and really understand this profound paradox. How did this unique bipolar ice age, which was caused by biological success, how did it shape the evolution of life?
How did it create giants?
And crucially, how did it store up these massive reserves of carbon, that coal that is so critical and, well, so hotly debated today?
We'll explore the world-changing climate shifts driven entirely by the plant life itself. We're going to meet the truly bizarre creatures of the swamp and sea, from predatory salamanders that stayed aquatic to strange fish that grew antlers.
And we'll have to examine the mysterious crisis that ended the reign of those towering scale trees.
And then trace that direct line from Carboniferous peat all the way to the global industrial revolution. So prepare yourself for a deep dive into a world forged in ice and carbon. So to truly grasp the Carboniferous, we have to appreciate the scale of the stage being set. This wasn't just a biological revolution, it was a continental reorganization.
That's absolutely right. The world was undergoing these drastic changes, sort of transitioning from the previous arrangement of continents toward unification.
Right.
You had this massive southern landmass, Gondwana, which was essentially modern-day South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia, all just mashed together.
All in one block.
All on one block, and it was slowly but surely drifting northwest. It was on a colossal collision course with the northern landmasses of Euro-America and Siberia.
This slow-motion continental pileup is what eventually culminates in the supercontinent Pangaea, right?
It does, but the initial grinding during the Carboniferous was already generating immense tectonic activity. We saw widespread mountain-building events, what geologists call orogenies, or crustal buckling and uplift.
And that uplift is key, not just for making mountains.
No, not at all. As vast surfaces of silicate rocks were pushed up and exposed to the atmosphere, they underwent increased chemical weathering.
Okay, so what does that actually mean for the climate?
Well, rainwater, which contains naturally dissolved atmospheric carbon dioxide, it reacts with these silicate rocks. That process locks the carbon away in solution, which is then just washed into the oceans.
Ah, so it's a massive natural CO2 sink.
A huge one. And it's one of the proposed mechanisms that helped kick off the long-term global cooling trend.
But while the continents were slowly drifting, the immediate game changer was happening right on the surface.
The green explosion.
The green explosion.
It was an incredible biological expansion. The explosion of plant biodiversity in the hot, humid environment of the early Carboniferous was just transformative.
Before this, plants were pretty much stuck to the coasts, right?
Largely restricted to coastal areas and riverbanks, yes. But now, major vascular plant groups, horsetails, club mosses, ferns, primitive conifers, early cycads, they truly got their start. This jungle just rapidly spread out, covering the entire globe in what must have felt like an endless, dense tree line.
But these were not the trees we know today. I mean, our sources describe them as utterly alien.
Oh, completely.
They dominated the landscape and were the engine of everything that followed. The most successful species was this primitive lipod, Lepidodendron. Can you just paint us a picture of what walking through a lepidodendron forest would have felt like?
It would have been dark and profoundly damp, almost cathedral-like, but in a very bizarre way.
How so?
Picture these colossi reaching 50 meters, that's about 160 feet tall. Their trunks were often over a meter wide, and the sources emphasized that they were largely branchless columns of scale-textured bark, just reaching straight up.
Straight up.
Until you hit a dense, umbrella-like canopy, almost like a fern or a palm frond explosion right at the very top.
So it's like walking through an enormous, poorly lit hall lined with these impossibly tall, rough pencil columns.
Exactly. And unlike modern trees, they didn't have wood as we know it. They had softer tissues and a method of secondary growth that made them prone to just rotting away when they died.
So they weren't sturdy.
Not in the same way. The lycophytes were still fundamentally wetland plants, obligate dwellers of swamps and perpetually damp soil, yet they were immensely successful, creating what one of your sources accurately calls the largest tropical peat mires in Earth history.
And their very success leads directly to the Great Climate Shift, which is the defining characteristic of this entire period.
It is the central mechanism. This global forest had a profound runaway impact on the atmosphere. As these billions of trees spread, they continuously performed photosynthesis on a scale never before seen.
Taking in massive amounts of CO2.
Massive amounts of carbon dioxide, and as a byproduct, expelling huge volumes of oxygen. But here's the key. They were locking that carbon into their hydrocarbon tissues.
And because they were growing in these waterlogged, swampy conditions, they weren't decomposing properly.
Precisely. Normal decomposition by fungi and bacteria, it releases the carbon back into the atmosphere as CO2 relatively quickly.
Right, it's a cycle.
But in these anaerobic, oxygen-poor swamp conditions, that process was dramatically inhibited. The plant matter was buried before it could fully decompose, causing the carbon burial rate to just skyrocket. This was, hands down, the greatest sustained carbon sequestration event in Earth history.
And the consequence of this massive CO2 drawdown is, of course, global cooling.
Correct. The atmosphere was starved of greenhouse gas, leading to a significant long-term global cooling trend by the middle of the Carboniferous.
And this is what kicks off the Ice Age.
This cooling allowed ice caps to form and stabilize at the South Pole for the first time in millions of years, initiating the prolonged Late Paleozoic Ice Age, or LPIA.
And you said this wasn't just a sudden deep freeze.
No, not at all. It was a 100 million year period defined by glacial and interglacial cycles. A long, long winter.
And the flip side of that massive carbon drawdown, the part that really shaped the biology, was the oxygen spike.
Yes. Because the carbon was trapped underground, the oxygen expelled by the plants was just building up in the atmosphere. The runaway effect meant that atmospheric oxygen levels rose dramatically, reaching as high as 35%.
That's compared to today's 21%.
Today's 21%.
Yeah.
You are living in an atmosphere 2/3 richer in oxygen than we are breathing right now.
That sounds exhilarating, but I know the sources pointed out some terrifying side effects, didn't they? Like the constant, intense threat of wildfire.
Absolutely. I mean, just think about the physics. At 21% oxygen, fires are common. At 25%, fires become much more widespread, igniting easily, even in relatively wet regions.
Okay.
But when you hit 30 or 35% oxygen saturation, almost any dry or even slightly damp foliage struck by lightning or even sparking rocks will catch fire.
Wow.
The sources cite evidence that Carboniferous coals contain an extraordinary amount of fossil charcoal, over 15% by volume, suggesting fires were just rampant and incredibly intense.
That's a huge contrast to modern tropical swamps, which are nearly charcoal-free because they're simply too wet to burn.
And they burned exceedingly hot. The very structure of the fossil charcoal suggests it formed at searing temperatures, possibly as high as 600 degrees Celsius, all driven by that rich oxygen atmosphere. These high-temperature flames could sweep through even the soggiest tropical swamp foliage.
So it was a perfect self-destructive feedback loop.
It was. The plants grew successfully, they cooled the world, oxygen spiked, and then the forest started burning intensely.
Yet, despite the fires, the sheer volume of material being buried was still creating the coal legacy.
This is the single critical way the period impacts our modern world. All the dead, partly decomposed plant matter, what we call peat, was slowly buried under layers of sediment. It was subjected to immense pressure and heat.
And that's what turns it into coal.
A transformation that eventually turned it into coal. And the crucial point here is that All the economically viable coal mined today can be traced back to these mighty Carboniferous forests. As much as 90% of all coal strata on Earth were deposited during the height of the late Paleozoic Ice Age. It's an ancient, buried treasure chest of energy.
So we have a cold world, but the air is richer than ever before. This hyperoxic atmosphere is the key to solving the great Carboniferous puzzle. How did the bugs get so massive? This is where it gets really interesting, because the usual biological limits were suddenly just lifted.
The gigantism enigma is fundamentally a question of biomechanics, and specifically respiration. We have to understand that terrestrial arthropods, insects, arachnids, millipedes, they breathe in a completely different way than we do.
Right, no lungs.
No centralized lungs and no circulatory system to pump oxygen everywhere.
They use the tracheal system, right? This network of tiny branching tubes extending from pore-like openings on their exterior, called spiracles, straight down into their body tissues.
Correct. And this reliance on tubes means their tissues are oxygenated entirely by simple diffusion. Oxygen molecules simply drift from the air, down the tubes, and into the cells.
Which creates a severe size limit.
A very severe one. The area volume constraint. Imagine trying to use a network of straws to deliver water to a massive sponge. As the insect gets larger, the volume of internal tissue increases much faster than the surface area of the tracheal tubes can expand.
And eventually, the oxygen just can't get to the center fast enough.
Exactly. Oxygen diffusion simply cannot reach the center of a large body volume efficiently enough to sustain it.
And that's the hard size limit that our modern 21% oxygen atmosphere imposes on insects.
Yeah.
But the Carboniferous blew that limit wide open.
Completely. The hyperoxic atmosphere at 30 to 35% O2 raised the maximum size limit significantly. With a much higher partial pressure of oxygen, meaning there are far more oxygen molecules packed into every breath of air, you can achieve sufficient oxygen diffusion to reach truly large internal tissue volumes.
So the arthropod giants of the Carboniferous are a direct and magnificent result of lifting this area volume constraint.
The direct result.
Let's meet some of these spectacular giants, starting with the undisputed heavyweight champion of all land invertebrates, a creature that is the stuff of nightmares, arthropleura.
Arthropleura was a herbivorous millipede. And we use that term loosely because it defies comparison. It grew up to 2.5 meters, that's 8 feet long, and was 150 millimeters or 6 inches wide.
8 feet long.
To put that in perspective, the sources compare it directly to the length of a modern alligator. Our largest modern millipede is barely over a foot long. Arthropleura was the largest land invertebrate ever to exist, just cruising through the damp underbrush.
Terrifying. And it wasn't alone. The arachnids also benefited from this atmospheric boost.
Yes, the terrestrial arachnid Pulmonoscorpius was a scorpion reaching 70 centimeters long. That's the length of a human arm.
Unbelievable.
It was a massive, fast-moving predator, and it represented the peak size for any terrestrial arachnid lineage in history. And if you thought the land was bad, the skies were dominated by the largest flying insects ever.
We're talking about the giant dragonflies.
Enter meganeura. This was essentially a supersized dragonfly, an efficient aerial predator, darting across the swamp lakes, just snatching up smaller insects.
And they got even bigger, right?
Later species, like Meganeuropsis permiana, were even larger, boasting wingspans as wide as a modern seagull. Their existence, large, powerful, energetically flying insects that require a tremendous amount of oxygen for those high-speed wing muscles, is arguably the strongest evidence we have supporting the high oxygen models for the Carboniferous.
But the gigantism wasn't limited to the invertebrates, though it did start with them. Vertebrates eventually followed suit later in the late Carboniferous, starting in the Muscovian age.
That's right. Vertebrates also attained huge sizes, a trend that was independent of their diet. Looking at our own lineage, the synapsids, the ancient ancestors of mammals, we see giant predatory forms like Ophiocodon uniformis reaching 2.5 meters, 8 feet long, and giant herbivores like Edaphosaurus cruciger at 3.5 meters, that's 11.5 feet long.
And the most recognizable of these early giants is, of course, the creature with that huge dorsal fin, Dimetrodon grandis.
Dimetrodon grandis. Its name literally translates to 2 sizes of teeth, of great size. It grew to 3 meters, 10 feet long. These predatory reptiles, along with the herbivorous Edaphosaurus, developed those hugely distinctive sails or crests on their backs.
What's the consensus now on that sail? Was it for display, defense, or something else entirely?
Well, the primary function is still thought to be thermoregulation. These animals were still ectotherms, relying on the environment for heat. But a structure like that sail, laced with blood vessels, would allow for sophisticated temperature control. They could orient the sail toward the sun to rapidly absorb heat in the cold morning, or angle it away from the sun and use the movement of air to shed heat when they were too warm.
And if the sources are correct about the hyperoxic atmosphere, that sail would be critically important, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. If these large, powerful synapsids had elevated metabolic rates due to the sheer abundance of oxygen, effectively operating at a higher engine speed, they would generate more internal heat that needed to be managed.
So they'd overheat.
The need for an efficient thermoregulatory mechanism like that sail would have been even more acute. The hyperoxia wasn't just fueling size, it was driving specialized adaptations like the sail to manage the metabolic costs of that size.
Okay, we've covered the big trends. The carbon sequestration, the oxygen spike, the resulting gigantism. Now we leave the general trends and look at the truly bizarre specialists who inhabited those dark, damp swamps and seas. The Carboniferous was a time of evolutionary experimentation, and it produced some absolute monsters and some enduring enigmas.
The world of the wet tropical mires was home to unusual basal tetrapods, creatures still finding their feet on land or, in many cases, deciding land wasn't worth the effort.
Like what?
Take Craganus scoticus, a creature that grew 2 meters or 6.5 feet long. It was an underwater ambush predator that, despite being a tetrapod, had effectively reversed its terrestrial evolution and could not leave the confines of the water.
So its limbs were vestigial, the sources say, only used for steering, yet it was a terrifying carnivore.
It was an incredible mouth attached to a body. Its skull was massive, featuring a huge array of sharp teeth and large palatal fangs in a second row. It had the mechanical ability to open its mouth 60 degrees wide to just engulf prey.
A true master of the aquatic ambush niche.
Absolutely. Preying on other fish and smaller amphibians that dared to swim too close to the riverbank.
And speaking of vulnerable animals, we need to circle back to the giant millipede. Even the 8-foot arthropleura faced a life-or-death crisis every time it needed to grow.
The molting process. Imagine being the largest land creature of your time, wrapped in armor, and then having to shed that armor entirely.
Right.
When arthropleura outgrew its rigid exoskeleton, it had to break free. And until the newly grown shell hardened, the animal was left soft, fleshy, and vulnerable to anything that walked or crawled. It was physically weakened, lacking the structural support of its carapace.
That's a huge target for anything predatory in the swamp, like the large amphibians or scorpions.
Exactly. Paleontologists believe that molts would have primarily taken place underwater, where the millipede could float slightly, living essentially like a soft-bodied worm until its new shell achieved rigidity.
And it would hide.
The research also suggests they might burrow into the hollow, decaying trunks of fallen liapod trees for protection and humidity during this critical time. It's an amazing vulnerability for an animal of that size.
Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum of vulnerability, we see the emergence of one of the greatest evolutionary breakthroughs in vertebrate history.
This is the critical innovation, the amniote egg, and it belongs to Hylonomus, the oldest known objective reptile in the fossil record.
Just a tiny little thing.
Tiny, agile, a lizard-like animal, only 25 centimeters, about 10 inches long, scurrying through the leaf litter, hunting for smaller arthropods.
But the egg fundamentally changed the game for vertebrates, didn't it?
Oh, completely. It was the ecological equivalent of the seed in plants. It provided a safe, self-contained protective cavity and nest for the embryo, complete with a food source and a waste disposal mechanism.
And critically, it freed vertebrates entirely from the constraint of needing water for reproduction.
That's the key. Amphibians had to lay their eggs in water. Reptiles and eventually mammals could now colonize the dry interiors of the continents.
And we know a surprising amount about the fate of Hylonomus, thanks to a rather brutal anecdote from the Joggins Formation in Canada.
It's a tragic footnote in paleontology. The giant club mosses were prone to falling in storms. When the huge trunks rotted away, they left these steep-sided hollow cavities.
Like a natural pit trap.
Exactly. Small animals like Hylonomus would crawl into these deep, vertical stumps for shelter during bad weather, only to find themselves trapped by the sheer, slippery sides once inside. They couldn't climb out and would eventually die of starvation, preserved perfectly inside their tomb.
That's how we found them.
It's how many of the best specimens of this foundational reptile were found.
Moving beyond the land and swamp, the aquatic environments were equally ferocious. We had an apex fish predator that ruled the rivers.
Meet Rhizodicibity. This was a fearsome aquatic fish predator, a truly dominant force. It was over 5.5 meters, that's 18.5 feet, in length, using its great size and speed to rule the broad lakes and rivers.
And its teeth.
Its most terrifying feature. Two fangs situated near the front of its jaws, each 22 centimeters, nearly 9 inches long. Imagine being snatched by an animal with teeth the size of small daggers.
And we also have to mention the relatives of the sea scorpions, the eurypterids, one of which maintained the ability to venture onto land briefly.
That was Hibopterus, a bizarre, heavily armored eurypterid. It reached almost 1.5 meters, 4.5 feet long, and was found across 3 continents, suggesting a widespread habitat.
So it could come out of the water.
It was primarily aquatic and equipped with gills, but the fossil record suggests it could venture onto land briefly, provided its gills remained wet. Its spined, sensory-tipped forward limbs were believed to have acted as rakes, sifting through detritus and smaller invertebrates on the bottom of murky lakes.
Now, for the biggest enigma of the Carboniferous, maybe one of the strangest creatures in all of paleontology, the Tully monstrum, or Tully monster.
Ah, the Tully monster. This creature is known exclusively from the Mason Creek fossil beds in Illinois, and since its discovery in 1966, scientists have been locked in a nearly 6-decade-long debate about where it belongs in the tree of life.
We still don't know.
Is it a mollusk, a specialized worm, an extinct fish, a bizarre vertebrate relative? We still don't definitively know.
It sounds like nothing else we've discussed. What makes it so utterly strange to classify?
Well, it was relatively small, only about 8 centimeters long, with a soft, tubular, cigar-shaped body. But its sensory and feeding apparatus, they just defy logic.
Go on.
It possessed a long, flexible proboscis tipped with a complex pincer structure, which may have been its primary feeding tool for probing muddy sediments. Even more bizarrely, its mobile eyes were set on stalks that jutted out from the sides of its body.
Stalk eyes and a pincer mouth on a cigar body.
Yes, it bears strong visual and functional similarities only to the Cambrian invertebrate Opibenia, which lived hundreds of millions of years earlier. Its presence in Carboniferous rock is highly unusual. It's truly an evolutionary island.
Finally, we have the cartilaginous fish, the sharks. They rose to prominence in the Carboniferous after the collapse of the Devonian armored fish, and they took on some truly outlandish forms.
They were evolving rapidly and spectacularly. Stethocyanthus productus, measuring 3 meters long, looked like a modern shark from the neck down, but its dorsal fin was shaped like a blacksmith's anvil, covered in sharp, spiky tentacles.
An anvil fin, what for?
Possibly used for mating, maybe clamping onto the female during reproduction, or potentially for display, we're not entirely sure.
And then there's the fish that grew headgear worthy of an ancient elk.
Harpagophyter. The males of this cartilaginous fish grew long, forked, antler-like structures on their heads that were attached via a rotating ball and socket joint.
That's incredible.
And they weren't permanent fixtures. They were likely shed and regrown annually. Given their absence in the females, they are believed to have served as elaborate display features or aids in mating rituals. The Carboniferous swamps and seas were truly realms of the specialized, where natural selection rewarded the bizarre.
The world of giants and endless productive swamps did not last. We mentioned that the late Paleozoic Ice Age wasn't one constant deep freeze. It was a period of intense, alternating glacial and interglacial cycles.
Mm-hmm.
And as those cycles intensified, the global climate became highly unstable, leading to a profound ecological shift known as the Casimovian crisis.
This crisis occurred during the late Carboniferous, and the evidence shows a sudden, dramatic retreat of the global rainforest. The tropical rainforest belt that circled the Earth shrank by over half, 53%, according to one of the sources.
Wow.
It was an ecological catastrophe centered on the dominant plants.
So this sounds like an extinction event centered entirely on the flora. The massive lepidodendrid-scale trees that defined the Carboniferous were nearly eliminated, with 87% of the dominant tree species going extinct.
Gone. And they were quickly replaced by shorter, dry-tolerant tree ferns.
So the whole structure of the forest changed.
Radically. The changeover restructured the entire biome. The ratio of towering trees to ground cover and vines flipped almost completely. The towering, pole-like lycophytes that required constantly wet habitats were replaced by the shorter, more resilient tree ferns. This fundamentally changed the canopy structure and the stability of the remaining forests.
So we have a clear ecological crime scene, the sudden elimination of the dominant plant species. The puzzle for paleontologists, then, is determining the motive. We have several strong but often mutually contradictory explanations detailed in the sources.
Right.
Let's look at the climate suspects first.
The first climatic explanation is the interpulse drying model. This links the extinction directly to the intensifying LPIA cycles. When ice caps expand, they lock up huge amounts of water, which lowers global sea levels.
Okay.
These glacial-interglacial cycles created extreme dry spells, or interpulses, that rapidly stress the obligate wetland lycophytes.
Wait, I have to pause there. That seems counterintuitive. They were killed by drought because of a global ice age.
It's the mechanism of the ice age causing the drought that's key. The extreme cooling and expansion of ice locked water away. Furthermore, the gradual tectonic assembly of Pangaea was causing monsoonal atmospheric circulation to develop, shifting rainfall patterns away from the equatorial tropics.
So the successful freezing of the planet led to widespread drought in the tropics, which killed the wetland species that had built the whole system.
Exactly.
So climate drove them out of their habitats. What's the second climatic theory?
The refugia constriction model. This is related to the first but focuses on habitat size. The intense glacial buildup drastically lowered global sea levels, triggering deep river erosion and downcutting.
And the trees needed to be right next to the water.
Because the obligate wetland lycophyte species could only survive immediately adjacent to water, their habitats became hyperconstricted to progressively deeper and narrower river valleys. They simply couldn't maintain sustainable populations and were eliminated through natural loss.
Now, let's look at the fascinating biological suspect. The theory of self-sabotage, or the hyperoxic kill-carbon depletion model.
This is the immense irony. The theory holds that the tree's own success in stripping CO2 from the atmosphere made them vulnerable. Atmospheric CO2 reached a minimum at the Muscovian-Casimovian boundary, while O2 reached its peak, possibly 35%.
So are you saying the successful growth of the trees actually choked them to death? That seems entirely counterintuitive.
It's based on a fundamental conflict in plant chemistry. Plants use an enzyme called rubisco to fix carbon during photosynthesis. But rubisco is not perfect. It can also react with oxygen, which is called photorespiration.
Okay.
When CO2 partial pressures are too low and O2 partial pressures are too high, as they were in the Carboniferous, the high oxygen interferes with the photosynthetic process, essentially suppressing productivity. The argument here is that the trees were starved of the necessary CO2 substrate while simultaneously being poisoned by their own massive oxygen production.
That's a great theory, but I recall the sources indicating there is conflicting, even challenging evidence regarding this carbon depletion model. How do we square that circle?
Well, critical thinking is essential here. While the theory is dramatic, later computer modeling suggested that if the CO2 content of the atmosphere was only slightly higher than the minimum predicted, say greater than 0.04%, then photosynthetic efficiency actually increases even under high oxygen. It offsets the cost and results in a net increase in carbon fixation, not a decrease. So the catastrophic kill effects are questionable under certain conditions.
And there was also direct fossil evidence about the atmosphere before the collapse that seemed to contradict the idea of constantly increasing oxygen.
Precisely. A study of the seed fern Neuropteris ovata showed a decrease in stomatal density in its fossil leaves just before the abrupt disappearance of the scale trees.
Stomatal pores are the tiny breathing holes on leaves.
Yes. And fewer pores suggest the plant needed less access to gases, which in this context could be evidence of a decrease in atmospheric oxygen content, not an increase. If oxygen was decreasing, the trees should have been recovering, not suddenly going extinct.
So that pushes us back toward the conclusion that climate-driven water stress, the drying, was likely the primary driver.
It does seem more likely.
And finally, we have the quick surgical kill mechanism, the tree blight model.
This is the fungal hypothesis. It's often favored because it explains the speed and completeness of the collapse. It suggests that a clade-specific fungus or pathogen, much like the invasive fungus that devastated the American chestnut tree population in the 20th century, evolved and rapidly spread worldwide.
And it only targeted these specific trees.
This specificity explains why the Lepidodendraceae were suddenly and completely eliminated globally, while other lycophyte species survived.
Even if the blight took a few hundred years to spread across the supercontinent, it would appear instantaneous in the geological record.
That's right. It explains the abrupt transition and why survivors didn't persist in smaller numbers in refugia. They all just vanished. Regardless of the exact cause, and it may have been a combination of water stress, tectonic changes, and maybe disease, the result was final. The great lepidodendrid forests were destroyed forever, replaced by tree ferns, leading to a profound reorganization of life on land.
So we have established the Carboniferous world crashed, replaced by hardier flora.
Mm,
But the instability of the late Paleozoic Ice Age was just the precursor to the end of the entire Paleozoic era.
right.
The chilling climatic shift and low diversity led to the Turnasian Gap right at the beginning of the Carboniferous.
That gap was a shocking period of reverse evolution. Following the end Devonian bottleneck, we see this 10 million year gap in the land vertebrate fossil record. The tetrapods that survived the initial chilling events, which had achieved advances toward a terrestrial life, showed a profound evolutionary reversal.
What do you mean, Verify?
They abandoned dry land and returned to a more aquatic lifestyle, using features like efficient land limbs. It's theorized the harsh, low-diversity ecosystem and challenging climate forced this retreat back to the water.
Wow, okay, so moving into the Permian, the lingering effects of the LPIA cycles combined with massive volcanism to seal the fate of the Paleozoic world. The Carboniferous set the stage, but the Permian delivered the final fatal blows.
It did.
We're talking about two massive extinction pulses here, beginning with the Capitanian crisis.
The Capitanian crisis, or the Guadalupian event, was the fifth most severe extinction event. It was triggered by the massive volcanic eruptions of the Imatian Large Igneous Province, or LIP, in South China. And here's the critical detail. The magma didn't just pour out. It penetrated and melted surrounding carbonate rock limestone strata in the Sichuan Basin.
So the volcanic activity itself wasn't the sole killer. It was the interaction with the existing rock that made it catastrophic.
Precisely. The hot magma performing contact metamorphism vaporized the rock, injecting enormous volumes of CO2 into the atmosphere. The eruption injected scores of trillions of tons of CO2, an absolutely staggering amount, many times greater than the sulfur dioxide released by the eruption itself.
Massive greenhouse gas injection, triggering catastrophic global warming, followed by ocean acidification from the sulfur dioxide.
Correct. The planet heated up, the oceans became acidic, and this caused major ecological restructuring and eliminated organisms that relied on calcium carbonate to build their shells, like corals and many other marine invertebrates.
But the truly apocalyptic event, the greatest biodiversity crisis in Earth history, happened shortly after the end Permian mass extinction, driven by the Siberian traps.
The Siberian superplume eruption was of a vastly, unimaginably greater scale. It spanned hundreds of thousands of years. But the key mechanism was the same, only magnified. The magma penetrated vast deposits of hydrocarbons, all that carboniferous coal, oil, and gas, as well as immense salt deposits or evaporates in the Tunguska Basin.
That's the critical link. All that stored carboniferous energy, the legacy of the Great Green Explosion, became the fuel for the apocalypse.
In a catastrophic feedback loop, yes. The contact metamorphism caused explosive venting through over 6,400 blast pipes across the basin, releasing a devastating cocktail of gases and toxins.
Let's simplify the cocktail. What were the key lethal releases?
First, immense volumes of greenhouse gases were injected, CO2 and methane, leading to runaway hyperthermia. But second, the eruption released toxins from the evaporates and surrounding rock, including highly corrosive acids like sulfuric and hydrochloric acid, and crucially halocarbons like methyl chloride, which are modeled to have utterly destroyed the global ozone layer.
And ozone destruction means life on the surface was exposed to lethal levels of UVB radiation.
Exactly. The increased UVB flux had devastating mutagenic effects, especially on plants, which cannot burrow to escape. You also had a severe depletion of global atmospheric oxygen due to the oxidation of trillions of tons of released methane, triggering widespread hypoxia.
So it's just a whole cocktail of ways to die.
A complex cocktail of kill mechanisms.
Yeah.
Hyperthermia, fatal heat. Acidosis, ocean acidification. Hypercapnia, CO2 poisoning. Hypoxia, suffocation, and radiation poisoning.
The result was the hot Earth aftermath, which lasted 5 million years into the early Triassic. What was that environment truly like for survivors?
Apocalyptic. The equatorial tropics became lethally hot, barren zones, forcing life to retreat to higher, cooler latitudes. This is why we see the tetrapod gap and the coal gap in the fossil record of equatorial regions.
And what about in the oceans?
Surviving marine life exhibited the Lilliput effect, meaning they were abnormally small and stunted, simply because smaller organisms have lower thermal tolerance in a rapidly heating environment.
And the dominant species that briefly flourished in this absolute hellscape was bizarrely specific: the burrowing Dicynodont Lystrosaurus.
Lystrosaurus became the ultimate disaster species. It was a small, barrel-chested, burrowing herbivore, and it constituted approximately 90% of all land vertebrates alive in the early Triassic.
90%. Why was it so successful?
Its survival was likely due to its unique physiology. Its barrel chest allowed it to tolerate low oxygen and high CO2 hypercapnia and hypoxia, and its burrowing ability allowed it to escape the severe surface heat and the lethal radiation caused by ozone depletion. It was a world entirely turned upside down where the humble burrower inherited the shattered earth.
So what does this all mean? We started in a world of giant bugs, built on a mountain of wood, and we ended in a hot, barren apocalypse defined by suffocating heat and radiation. But the most profound impact of the Carboniferous isn't the memory of arthropleura. It lies in how it influences us today.
We have to reiterate the ultimate legacy, coal. The massive deposits, 90% of which were formed during the late Paleozoic Ice Age, were the necessary fuel source for the Industrial Revolution 250 million years later.
Yeah, it's just sitting there waiting.
Humans discovered these strange black rocks that burned hotter and longer than wood, and once the efficient modern steam engine was perfected, that ancient carbon became the indispensable driver of global civilization.
The great industrial centers in England, Wales, Germany, they all arose along the geological outcrops of Carboniferous coal. Without the Carboniferous and its unique ecological and climatic circumstances, the Industrial Revolution as we know it might never have happened.
Or at least would have been severely constrained and delayed.
And this is the immense, profound irony of deep time. The ancient world's extreme carbon sequestration event, caused by the hyper-successful lycophyte forests, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, triggering a global ice age, and creating the hyperoxic conditions, is now being rapidly reversed by humans.
We are settling a 300-million-year-old carbon debt in the space of 2 centuries.
It's unbelievable when you put it like that.
We are burning that same stored carbon, releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere at a catastrophic rate, fundamentally reversing the work of 70 million years of forest growth and burial, leading directly to modern global warming. It is the definition of a direct geological feedback loop playing out in human history.
And more fundamentally, the history of life on land was shaped by this massive atmospheric change.
Absolutely. The resulting spike in oxygen powered the rise of giants and spurred the evolution of efficient flight in insects, establishing them as the dominant aerial life form they remain today. Moreover, the evolution of the amniote egg, which freed our synapsid ancestors from the water, was contemporaneous with that shift, positioning our lineage for survival when the Permian extinction finally cleared the ecological playing field.
So if the late Paleozoic Ice Age had never happened, not only would we lack 90% of the coal that built our civilization, but the course of evolution itself. From the flight of insects to the ultimate survival of our synapsid ancestors during that crucial Tornasian gap would have been radically, fundamentally different.
Which leaves us with a final question. Perhaps the biggest question for us to mull over is this. What other gifts or latent disasters from deep-time geological structures, stored carbon, ancient toxins, are we currently unearthing and manipulating without fully understanding the true, long-term environmental cost? The Carboniferous reminds us that the success of life, particularly rapid global biological innovation like forestation, can itself be a massive driver of planetary change, often with unpredictable and explosive consequences down the line. We are just the latest and by far the fastest geological force to manipulate that ancient carbon debt.